January 1999. Canada's largest city stood still. Not from war, not from disaster, from snow. 3 blizzards, 2 weeks, 118 centimeters, numbers that mean nothing until you understand what they buried. January 2nd. The first storm arrived quietly. 47 centimeters of snow in a single day. Streets disappeared. The city slowed, but it held. The weekend brought no relief. A second system moved through, 10 to 15 centimeters more. The removal crews fell behind, then further behind. January 13. The third storm arrived, the worst of them. 78 centimeters, in 3 days, on a city already buried. Public transit stopped, buses abandoned mid-route, subway stations overwhelmed. Passengers stranded on platforms. The city's circulatory system had simply ceased to function. Emergency vehicles couldn't reach hospitals. Ambulances were turning back. Elderly residents were trapped in homes without food. The infrastructure of a city of 4 million people had collapsed under the weight of snow. Mel Lastman had been mayor of Toronto since 1997. Time equals 550 milliseconds, greater than, a bombastic, unconventional politician. Not the kind of leader people expected to make careful decisions, but on January 12th he made one. He declared a state of emergency, and then he made the call that would define his legacy, not among history books, but among late-night comedians for the next 18 months. 400 Canadian Armed Forces troops deployed to Toronto streets with shovels for snow removal. The rest of Canada didn't wait for context. The reaction was immediate, it was merciless. And in some corners of the country, it was genuinely very funny. Montreal looked south and shook its head. 200 centimeters of snow, every single winter, without a single soldier in sight. Montreal didn't call the army, Montreal called Tuesday. Calgary changed highway signs. The exact messages varied depending on the source, but the spirit was the same. A city famous for Chinooks and bitter winters was pointing fingers and laughing. National newspapers ran editorials, not just reporting, editorializing, judging. A mayor who called the military for snow had, apparently, committed an act requiring national commentary. Late-night television found its new recurring character. Mel Lastman, shovel in hand, flanked by soldiers, clearing snow from a city that couldn't clear its own sidewalks. Political opponents were certain. This was the end. No politician survives this kind of mockery. No mayor calls the military for snow and then wins an election. It simply doesn't happen. But the opponents were watching the wrong people. They were watching each other. They were watching commentators. They were watching the national press. They weren't watching Toronto residents. Toronto residents remembered something the rest of Canada didn't. They remembered being there. They remembered what 118 centimeters actually felt like from the inside. They remembered the silence of a city that had stopped, the particular dread of knowing an ambulance could not reach you, the knowledge that the system had failed, and that someone finally had responded. The soldiers had arrived. They shoveled, they cleared. They made it possible for ambulances to move, for food to reach people. Time equals 4 milliseconds greater than for a city to breathe again. 400 pairs of hands that shouldn't have needed to be there, but were. The months that followed were loud with mockery, nationally, relentlessly. Mel Lastman did not apologize. He did not walk back the decision. He let the country laugh. He governed. He managed the city. He kept working. And somewhere beneath the noise of a nation laughing, a quiet calculation was forming among the people who actually lived in Toronto. November 13th, 2000. Election Day. Toronto went to the polls. Time equals 550 milliseconds, / The country didn't pay much attention. The outcome seemed obvious. Lastman was finished. Everyone said so. The results came in. Mel Lastman, 80%. His closest opponent received less than 10% of the vote. The national joke had just produced one of the largest municipal election landslides in Canadian history. The national press had to reckon with something uncomfortable. The people they had laughed with had not been the people doing the voting. The voters were somewhere else. They were in Toronto, and they had been in the snow. There is a gap, a vast and persistent gap, between the people who comment on decisions and the people who live with their consequences. The blizzard of 1999 made that gap visible. Montreal was right. They do handle more snow. Calgary is right. They are tougher winters. But neither Montreal nor Calgary was responsible for 4 million people that January. Mel Lastman was. A decision made in crisis is not a decision made with the luxury of hindsight. Mel Lastman did not have November 2000 available to him in January 1999. He had one city. Time equals 4 milliseconds / one storm. One choice. He made a call that exposed him to ridicule, and that ridicule came. Immediately, nationally, relentlessly. He absorbed it. He didn't retreat. He governed. The 1999 Toronto blizzard is remembered by the country as a joke. It is remembered by Toronto residents as the crisis it actually was. That difference, that gap in lived experience, is everything. There is something in democratic systems that commentators perpetually underestimate. The voter who was cold, the voter who was hungry. Time equals 600 milliseconds / the voter who watched the soldiers arrive and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, that someone was there. That vote, 80%, was not a referendum on whether calling the military was wise. It was a referendum on whether Mel Lastman showed up. And he had. The lesson was not that calling the military was right. The lesson was not that Toronto deserved the mockery. The lesson was simpler and far older. Results outlast perception. Mel Lastman would go on to have a complicated legacy. Controversies would follow. Time equals 600 milliseconds / But the blizzard of 1999 and the election of 2000 remained the defining chapter, the one that proved the gap between national perception and local truth. Canada laughed. Toronto voted. The scoreboard, at the end, was unambiguous. 400 troops, 118 centimeters of snow, 80% of the vote, the arithmetic of vindication. Sometimes, history doesn't make the loudest voice right. Sometimes, history makes the person who showed up right. Mel Lastman showed up, with 400 soldiers, in the snow. And Toronto remembered. The blizzard of 1999 is not just a weather story. It is a story about the distance between the people who watch and the people who live, about what decisions look like from the outside and what they feel like from within. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. It is a small action, but it ensures these stories continue to exist. If you want to directly support the creation of future documentaries, Super Thanks is available below. And write in the comments, where are you watching from? Had you heard this story before? Canada laughed, Toronto voted, and the most mocked mayor became, quietly, permanently, the most vindicated.